Today I want to talk about the science behind biological sex and answer the question, is sex a spectrum? Before we get into it, here's your too long didn't watch. Is sex a spectrum? No, dummy. One of the most commonly cited publications to support trans ideology and the idea that sex is a spectrum is this piece done by Simon Sun on the Scientific American blog. For a more in-depth discussion, I personally recommend checking out the Paradox Institute's response to that publication, where they not only refute the notion that biological sex is a spectrum, but they cite a wealth of sources as well. To summarize the Paradox Institute's response, they're essentially pointing out that the Scientific American journal is using variations in sex to argue that sex is not binary. However, that's looking at these variations and reaching the wrong conclusion. These variations aren't evidence of another sex, nor is it evidence that sex isn't binary. Indeed, these variations only prove that variations can exist. And despite those variations in secondary sexual traits, the foundational definition of biological sex remains rooted in gametes. And again, despite those variations, there's still only two gametes. Again, there are only two gametes, and what size gamete you have determines your biological sex, despite any other variations that you might have that aren't as common. Those variations do not represent a brand new sex. And seeing these variations as a whole new sex only works to other people with medical conditions and complexities to their biological sex, which is a point that the Paradox Institute made in another response video that they did. And I think this one really summarizes how people are using and misrepresenting this science to fit their narrative. They're not using the fundamental definition of sex because they're leaving out gamete. They're using very old science, and they're othering people. Ultimately, these people are conflating gender and biological sex. And they're trying to make that concept like backwards compatible with science, and that's not how science works. We need to remember that gender and biological sex are two different concepts. One is a biological reality, the other is socially constructed. And these outliers, such as trans people, intersex people, hermaphrodites, they're not evidence that there's whole new biological sexes or that sex isn't binary. They simply represent the diversity within biological sex and nature. And above everything else, we need to remember what taking away the definition of biological sex means for people who are oppressed on the basis of their biological sex. We need to stop othering people with variations in their chromosomal makeup because nature has made it clear what sex they are despite those variations. And we must keep the definition of biological sex intact in order to protect marginalized communities.